Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our latest Path for Europe speaker event. I'm Ian Bartle. Thanks all for registering. Very pleased to welcome Professor Chris Gray to talk about his book, Brexit Unfolded. Chris is Emeritus Professor of Organisation Studies at Royal Holloway, University of London. His academic interest has been in the kind of interface between politics and business. As far as I understand, he first became particularly interested in the EU and Brexit before the referendum. So it hasn't been a decades-long interest. And interest was particularly sparked by the potentially huge consequences for politics and the economy if Britain voted to leave. But it is, of course, his blog, his Brexit blog, that Chris has become well known for in recent years. I mean, he started writing it soon after the referendum, and I think the interest was slow initially, but it began to build up. And now the blog, which is called Brexit and Beyond, has incredibly had 6.6 million views or more, I think. So I'm just a little before doing this event thinking, when did I first come across the blog? I think it was sometime late in 2017, particularly after the 2017 election, you know, when our hopes, Remainers' hopes, had risen significantly. And Brexit was really up in the air, and it was far from clear what was going on, where we were heading. I was keen to find out more. I mean, I have read my fair share of stuff on the EU, lots of academic stuff, long academic papers, and lots of journalistic stuff. I found Chris's blog a really nice sort of medium between the two, as it were. I found it was very readable, didn't take too long to read, but was saying something of substance. It was also grounded, I found, in evidence. And it has to be said, he was saying things that at times I don't think we really wanted to hear. And I also liked that he didn't get too wrapped up in making grand predictions, as many commentators did. You know, it's tempting looking back to say what happened was inevitable, but there was huge uncertainty at the time. There were, particularly in the blog, I thought, many recurring themes. So I was really interested and glad when I heard, I think it was last year or the year before, when I heard that he was writing a book on it, which of course is the book Brexit Unfolded, which we're going to hear about tonight. So so the format for this evening is that Chris will speak, I think probably for about 20 to 30 minutes or so. I have one or two questions that I'd like to ask, and I'll pose those questions, and then we can hand back to Emma. So if you have a question particularly that you want to pose, could you put it in the chat and clearly mark it as a question? The event will be recorded, I think Emma's just said that, and put up on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be filmed, then switch your camera off. Okay, that's all from me. So over to you, Chris.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks, Ian, for the welcome, and thanks, Emma, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks to so many of you. What looks like 182 so far who've turned up to hear. So I'm going to show a few slides. So I'm just going to try to bring those up for you now. And the image there is of the book that Ian has just mentioned, Brexit Unfolded, How No One Got What They Wanted. I've just been muted by the host.
That was my mistake. Sorry about that. Okay, carry on.
Okay, that's a good one. So yes, so that's the book Brexit Unfolded, and so on. And I kind of am going to talk about the book, but I'm not going to talk about it in detail so much as so much as to talk about the ways developing from it that we can see Brexit to be still unfolding. But so far as the book itself is concerned, I will just sort of say a little bit about reactions to it, which have been still quite good, quite interesting. And I won't talk through all these quotes, but some nice words from Jonathan Dimbleby. And I like that quote because it's from an Irish journalist, and the Irish dimension of Brexit, not just the Northern Irish, but the Irish dimension is so important, and so in many ways, insufficiently understood in this country. Some nice words from Caroline Lucas, from the composer Howard Goodall, from Brian Cox. But I don't want you to think it's been all plain sailing, because a few weeks ago, this bounced into my Amazon reviews, telling us that the book should not be taken seriously, and that it's for hardcore, bitter Remainers, which is actually quite odd, because there are actually quite a lot of things in that book which I think that people on the Remain side don't like very much either. But anyway, so that's the book. But what I wanted to talk about this evening was sort of 4 lines of thought that derive, that are contained within that book, and which sort of derive from it in terms of what is happening now. So the first line of thought, the quote from the book, that the end of the transition period was not an end, but the beginning of a new phase in the unfolding of Brexit. That the situation of Northern Ireland in particular was set up in such a way as to make future problems and disputes inevitable. And that's, for me, that word inevitable is just quite a strong word, because as Ian indicated in his introduction, I don't in general think that notions of inevitability are very helpful in general, but certainly in relation to Brexit. But I think that what has unfolded in terms of Northern Ireland was to some degree inevitable. And the third line of thought, that as soon as any form of Brexit was actually defined or articulated, that at least some group of Brexiters would say that was a betrayal, that it wasn't true Brexit. And then the final line of thought, from the book, the inescapable fact is that Brexit or no Brexit, UK is inextricably linked to the rest of the continent by geography, history, and economy. So I will talk, as Ian suggested, for perhaps 20 minutes about each of those lines of thought. So looking at the first of those, the idea that it was the beginning, that it wasn't the end, but the beginning of a sort of new phase in an unfolding process. And of course, that was something which was very much concealed, certainly concealed by Boris Johnson's sort of promise, to get Brexit done at the 2019 election, which might have led people to think that, initially it might have led people to kind of think, it would all be done when his oven-ready deal was signed. But of course, apart from anything else, that was simply the beginning of the negotiations for the trade and what became the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but even when that phase was completed and we got to the end of the transition period, we can see that that was itself just the beginning of yet another phase within this process. And although right from the day after the referendum, you could begin to see all kinds of economic effects associated with Brexit, I suppose that it was when we got to the end of the transition that the realities of those economic effects in particular started to be much more visible. And of course, it was complicated and remains complicated because of the pandemic to exactly sort of say, well, what's Brexit and what isn't. But it's clear that that maybe not with absolute perfection and absolute precision, but it's clear that we can, to some significant degree, separate out what are the Brexit effects and what are not Brexit effects. And the visibility, for example, of sort of fish being unsold and rotting, we began to see these pictures on the first day or the first working day after the transition period. That wasn't a coincidence that it suddenly became visible. That was the moment that what I think Michel Barnier called economic Brexit really began to happen. And so we have seen growing evidence of the suppression of trade, and there shouldn't be any surprise about that. If you introduce new barriers to trade, then by definition there will be less trade than otherwise would have been. But of course, also in both the, and relatedly, both the supply and labour crises that we've experienced this year. And again, as Brexit is of course very from say, well, these things are happening worldwide, and there's some truth in that certainly, but uniquely well, I was going to say in the UK, but certainly uniquely in Great Britain, those problems were added to by Brexit. And then, of course, even after we passed the transition period, there were key kinds of parts of Brexit that were still to be implemented. And as most people will know, it's only really since the 1st of January of this year that most of UK import controls began to be introduced, and only began to be introduced. There's a further 2 phases of those to come over the next 6 months. It's only from 1st of January that we've had certification of origin of UK exports to EU, and that's important because having to provide that certification is what enables an exporter, I'm talking about, not an importer, an exporter to demonstrate that a sufficient percentage of their good was actually made in the UK to qualify to be traded tariff-free in terms of the rules of origin, part of the trade cooperation agreement. Of course, there were Northern Ireland grace periods in the introduction of the Northern Ireland Protocol, some of which have been postponed by agreement with the EU, others of which have been extended unilaterally by the UK. All the issues about fishing licenses still had to be dealt with, and we saw how that gave rise to significant issues last year. Confirmation of UK participation in Horizon still actually hasn't happened, partly because I think it's become bound up with the arguments over Northern Ireland. And then all of the issues around conformity assessment, at the moment there's the ongoing use of the CE mark, in other words, the European Union Conformity Assessment Mark. The UK is meant to be introducing its own scheme, and it's effectively a duplication of that, but that has been postponed yet again. So that still is going to be what sort of, I think I might to say 2023 before that is now due to come in, and even later actually for medical devices. And then we've got other kinds of things which have happened but which may change. So the EU, one of the very important developments was that the EU agreed that UK data protection provisions were adequate for EU purposes, but that's something which is in the gift, if you like, of the EU and could potentially be reversed in the future. And equally, for the time being, the EU won't allow the UK which has applied to be a member of the Lugano Convention, so a convention governing the application of judgments made in the court in one country to another. That potentially could change direction, and the UK could be omitted. And indeed, even the Trade and Cooperation Agreement itself could, in certain circumstances, be suspended, and in any circumstances is due to be reviewed after 5 years. So 5 years, that's to say 5 years after it's having been made. So there's an enormous amount of stuff which is still ongoing, both through the transition period and now that we are beyond the transition period. So the first set of thoughts is that this, I think, not sure that maybe this is a slight exaggeration, but we could almost say that the Brexit is going to be a never-ending process in some way, that there's always probably going to be, in not dissimilar way to the way that, for different reasons, that there are in Switzerland, that there's always the relationship is always going to have to be managed and negotiated in some way or other. And in that sense, perhaps Brexit will never quite be done. And then the second line of thought from the book, the idea that the Northern Ireland situation was set up in such a way that made future disputes inevitable. And I mean, I think obviously, the book ends at the end of the transition period, and I wrote it just before the end and finishes off just after the end of the transition period. But it seems to me it was already clear, but it's become even more clear now that this core provision of the Northern Ireland Protocol, that there would be an Irish sea border, which, don't forget, was this was announced with a great fanfare as a great triumph by Boris Johnson and David Frost, of course, who had been a negotiator, because this was what enabled them to, as they put it, ditch the hated backstop within Theresa May's withdrawal agreement. But I mean, I think that within days of it having been agreed, and certainly within days of it having, actually hours of it having been signed, you had both, not just Boris Johnson, but also Dominic Raab, when he was Foreign Secretary, Brandon Lewis, the Northern Ireland Secretary, just sort of saying in terms there will be no sea border. So it seems pretty clear that they didn't accept. You can perhaps say they didn't understand what they'd agreed to, which would be, recklessly reprehensible, or that they simply never intended to honour it in the first place. And there's quite a bit of evidence now that that's the case, including statements that Dominic Cummings had made. And of course, this itself had a context that we don't have time to talk about this evening, but which is laid out in some detail in the book, going back to the very early phase 1 agreement that was made with the EU, which included an agreement about the Irish border, which ironically was not dissimilar to what we actually ended up with, that immediately David Davis disowned within days of having made all of the rows about the internal market bill and so on and so forth. And so out of that kind of soil, then they grew these latest episodes of bad faith. And of course, this was made very much complicated by the what was undoubtedly a ridiculous mistake by the EU, the suggestion not followed through and immediately abandoned, but nonetheless made in relation to stopping the export of EU-produced vaccines into Northern Ireland, which has been used, I would say, entirely opportunistically ever since by politicians up to and including Liz Truss last weekend to justify the UK stance. And of course, the UK stance on the Northern Ireland Protocol, as has happened so often with Brexit, has moved from softer to harder and harder. And in particular, it wasn't until July of last year that this new demand that there should be no role at all for the European Courts of Justice in Northern Ireland was introduced by David Frost, presumably on behalf of the government, which had never been raised before, but clearly had been right, in the agreement, right back to when it was made or when the negotiation on that was finished in the autumn of 2019. What's going to happen? Well, this is obviously very much a live issue at the moment, and it will be ongoing. What difference it will make that Liz Truss has taken over from David Frost? All of this is kind of unclear. But I mean, I think that one quite likely outcome of it is that there won't be a definitive outcome. That there will be a kind of a fudged agreement, which again, immediately it's made, the UK government will sort of start to agitate against, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if it sort of goes on like a running sore for months and months, if not longer. So that's my kind of second line of thought from the book, and then my third line of thought, which I think reflects what we've seen throughout the Brexit process from 2016 onwards, and we're continuing to see now, is this idea that whenever Brexit gets defined in any particular form, some Brexiters will say it's a betrayal. It's a betrayal of true Brexit, and of course that was set up in some ways by the way that that in the referendum campaign the form that Brexit would take wasn't specified, and the way in which different versions of Brexit were kind of sort of mixed and matched, and so that in itself sort of provides sort of fertile ground for people to say, oh, well, this isn't real Brexit. But I think that even if that hadn't been the case, that at least for a certain strand of kind of Brexit of political psychology, if we can call it that there's such a kind of an investment in the idea of victimhood, of being betrayed, and so on, that they would in any case be minded to call Brexit a betrayal. And that, in a sense, is, if it comes from the problem from a certain kind of Brexit standpoint, the problem, ironically, of having actually won. Because if you are the downtrodden victim of the elite, what happens to you when you win and your policy becomes the dominant policy of the day? And I would suggest that the only way in which you can kind of maintain your sense of downtroddenness is to say, ah, yes, but they're not delivering real Brexit. Anyway, whether or not that's the case, what certainly is true is that what I call the Brexit ultras in the book and on the blog, the most extreme, the most committed Brexiters, that they absolutely, although they voted for it in Parliament, that they have repeatedly denounced not just the protocol, but the entire withdrawal agreement. As they say, it's not sovereignty compliant, and they undoubtedly still, some of them anyway, would like there to be no deal. They've never accepted the legitimacy of. They've never accepted the need for any kind of border in relation to Ireland. They've never accepted the legitimacy, actually, I would say, of the divorce payment either. And that continues to play out, I think, in the way that we see what seems to be this kind of need for and desire for both perpetual conflict with the EU as an external enemy that is depicted as kind of punishing Britain for its choice, but actually equally an internal perpetual conflict with Remainers or some proxy for Remainers. And we've seen how the whole of the kind of the Brexit debate has in some ways sort of morphed into and become somewhat inextricable from a wider kind of cultural war over a whole range of issues which ostensibly are not connected with Brexit at all. And I suppose where we are, well, one of the places we are with that at the moment is this interesting phase, which I talked about on the blog last week, for those of you who read it, which is growing numbers of sort of committed Brexiters complaining, well, as David Frost did in his resignation, well, we haven't made full use of Brexit opportunities, by which they mean primarily deregulation, I suppose. And so it's another version of, well, this isn't true Brexit, saying it's not my Brexit. But I mean, the interesting and in some ways surprising thing is that none of the high-profile advocates of Brexit have ever recanted. None of them have ever said this whole thing was a terrible mistake. It's always, there was nothing wrong with it, but it wasn't done properly, that it was betrayed by, and then they have various explanations of that, but they all kind of circle around, oh, well, Theresa May was secretly a Remainer, which is an extraordinary proposition, that the civil service sabotaged true Brexit, that the Remainer establishment sort of sabotage, all of these kinds of things are used as kind of excuses. But again, because of that perpetual sense of grievance, it's another reason why the Brexit process will perhaps last, forever is a long time, isn't it? But for a long time, or for years, perhaps for decades. But then the fourth sort of line of thought from the book, in contrary in a sense to some of those things, is that like it or not, the facts of geography, the facts of history, the facts of economy mean that there is always going to be a relationship between the UK and the EU. The question of leave or remain is a dead question. It's not possible to we can't remain because we've left, we can't leave because we have already left. So the question both now and for the future is always necessarily going to be how that relationship develops. And I would suggest that at the moment, there are a few things that need to be thought about. I mean, one is, in some ways, although Brexit has perhaps never been out of the news, it's also, partly perhaps because of the pandemic, it's also kind of remarkable how this huge kind of shift is is so little kind of talked about. And the Conservatives and Boris Johnson clearly don't want to talk about it very much. And recently we had this idea of not even wanting the civil service to use the word Brexit. And the Labour Party have been very reluctant to talk about it for reasons people will understand, but primarily seeing that as being a kind of a culture war trap to push them to sort of wrong foot them. And obviously, Conservatives and Labour are not the only parties, but they get the biggest kind of share of media attention. So I think that because the relationship is necessarily an ongoing one, then it is ridiculous and completely unsustainable not to talk about it. And then the question becomes the way in which we talk about it. And I mean, one of the most remarkable things about Brexit, from my point of view, it's not just an issue about, oh, it's a policy that I or many other people disagree with, but the way in which it is absolutely larded through with either with sort of dishonesty or just with complete kind of fantasy about quite basic sorts of things in terms of how trade operates or how international relations operates or something like that. And so as well as stopping the silence, we also need to improve the truthfulness and the realism of the discussion that we have, because viewed from a kind of, one can debate exactly what it means, but from a sort of a rational kind of perspective of strategic self-interest, then the logic of the relationship, even outside of the EU, is for the UK to be economically harmonised and in political harmony. In a world where who are your friends and allies? The logic is well, that includes the European Union very significantly. And so if ultimately we think that there is any kind of rationality in politics, and that's obviously a big if, then the question is how we get to that economic harmonisation and political harmony. And I would say, well, from where we are, that has got to be, will have to be inevitably gradual, will consist of a series of more or less pragmatic steps towards that. Whether that can be delivered by a Conservative government, certainly in the present state of the Conservative Party, seems unlikely. But actually, even with this government, you can see underneath the radar all kinds of fairly low-key, kind of quite technical ways in which there is some degree of sort of pragmatism around regulation, for example. Some, I don't want to overstate it. And of course, the prime block to this pragmatism and to this rationality is the perpetual antagonism of the Brexit ultras towards the European Union, which has just absolutely poisoned and made toxic the relationship in ways which are hugely damaging for the UK. But actually, in some ways, campaigning to rejoin the EU isn't particularly helpful in this context either, because that, I think, is even if it is even a realistic possibility ever, is such a long way off that you would have you have to think of it in terms of some kind of steps in that direction as opposed to jumping towards that. And I think that so poisonous has Brexit been, both for our relationship with the EU, but also internally within our own country. Both the United Kingdom and within England, that I think we have to see that this is absolutely, going to be, it's a generation at least before we get to a normalization of sort of, of relations that are not constantly refracted through the lens of the dead question, should we stay or should we go? And the way that task is undertaken, of course, the government, the state is a key kind of actor, but actually there's all kinds of important things at sort of grassroots level, at civic level, that we could think of to at least keep alive and somewhat cleanse, somewhat detoxify compared with the situation that we're in. It's obviously, as the whole of this talk is meant to suggest, a constant process. Things seem to change, if not every week, then every few weeks. There's always things happening. And so my little plug for the blog is to keep on top of the whole thing by reading the Brexit and Beyond blog, and every Friday morning you'll find a new post on it, usually about 8:30 in the morning, sometimes 9 o'clock. Which also, and I think this, if I can say it, is one of the values of the blog, is that it doesn't just have, it's primarily my kind of take on what's going on, but it is also very carefully and quite heavily linked to kind of news, evidence, comment of other people, and so in that way is also a sort of a portal for people who want to keep on top of what is often very difficult to keep on top of because of its complex and hydra-headed nature. So I will stop there. I think that is my 25 minutes.
Yep, good. Thank you very much, Chris. Excellent, very interesting. Given that your book, I'll start with a question going back really to the after the referendum and through to 2000 and the election, the disastrous election 2019. You know, we built such a huge grassroots campaign. Many of us on this call probably involved in it. Huge London marches. Despite this, we lost. I'm just kind of wondering, you know, what do you think about what we did? Could we have done something different? Where did we go wrong? What should we have done in that period when we built up a great grassroots movement, and yet we seem to be defeated by these Brexit ultras who represent a very small, you know, portion of people in society.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, what could we have done differently? I mean, it's clear looking back that what a lot of people were not aware of at the time, and I was certainly only very dimly aware of it, was what an utter mess the People's Vote campaign was in at its sort of senior levels, and how riven by conflicts, many of which were, as far as I can understand, more personal than they were political, although they may have been both. So I think from that point of view, you know, the people who took to the streets and who came so close, actually, to getting at least another referendum, which isn't, by the way, the same as saying it would have reversed Brexit. I mean, you know, we can't say what the outcome of that referendum would have been had it been held. But I think I think those people did as much as they could, and it was their leaders. It was the leaders who were at least sort of partly at fault. But of course, the other thing is again, if we're talking about a second referendum, I mean, that was never going to happen unless MPs voted for it to happen. And they refused to do that. And I mean, I think that, you know, if we look at the kind of the schisms that there were between different kinds of groupings of MPs, I'm talking now within the 2017 to 19 Parliament, because obviously after the 2019 election, this was a dead issue. But that, you know, that there are some ways in which people who I think have sort of rewritten history about those years, and sort of say, oh well, you know, Remainers refused to compromise on Theresa May's deal. I think that's rubbish. But I think what is true is that when there was that period, if you remember, of the indicative votes in Parliament, that there was at that point an opportunity to, for example, you know, people may remember the Kyle Wilson amendment, which was the Labour amendment, which would have approved Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, but with the rider of attaching a referendum, a confirmatory referendum to it. You know, MP could have voted for that. I mean, ultimately, people taking to the streets and protesting can only create pressure. It can't create the legislation that would make a referendum. So I don't think that. I mean, the only other thing I would say, which may be unpopular, possibly with some people in this audience, is that, or maybe not, is, although I don't think in the end it made a huge amount of difference, but I think the other thing I was very critical of was the way that the Lib Dems went to the 2019 election with the policy of revoking Article 50, revoking unilaterally Article 50 without a referendum. And as I say, perhaps it wouldn't have made that much difference, but I mean, it was totally unnecessary, and it meant that the Lib Dems, who were potentially the most important pro-European voice in what that parliament would have been. It meant that every single question in the course of that campaign began with, oh, so you want to revoke? And it was a crazy policy. As I say, would it have made any difference? I don't know. Didn't help.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, looking forward a little bit now, in your blog last week, you said that there's a very interesting blog about Brexiters are now getting worried about history's judgment. And sometimes, I mean, people criticize you of being a bit pessimistic when, you know, in Twitter, they read your very good blog, but now I feel really depressed. But there was a little bit of hope in the last sentence, I think, which is that when when this judgment is clear, that it's an abject failure and disastrous folly, then new possibilities will flow. I wonder what you think that those possibilities might be, when they might be, and whether that can get sort of over this grip that this victimhood and betrayal cycle that the ultras have got us into.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure it's right, by the way. You will criticize me for being pessimistic. I think it's true. I am, but I think I seem to get quite a lot of praise for pessimism, and sometimes get told off for optimism. So, I think the crucial thing about the post you're referring to is it does say history will judge, and history is a long, history is a long process. I mean, I don't really think that that's imminent. And as I said, suggested at the end of my talk, I think that. Maybe things can. I mean, one has to be careful here because sometimes things can change very quickly, and that's a possibility. But I think it is more sort of generational, because I think if you look at those really kind of hardcore people in both in the Tory party and in the Brexit party or whatever it's called now, and around that. I mean, until those people have really faded from politics. I don't, and that's why I think it's, maybe I didn't make this sufficiently clear, but that's why I think that it's this thing about realism and honesty, and I refer to it as a battle. And what I mean by that is that for all of us in whatever we do, that there is underway and has been maybe since the referendum, but certainly since we left the EU, a battle for the meaning, for the narrative, and when that shifts. If that shifts, then that's the precondition for anything else happening. Yeah, and what that would be, I mean, who knows? The world is going to look very different to the people of I say our children's age. I'm looking at some of the faces on the Zoom call, and maybe I'm wrong, but it's mainly kind of the younger people. And it's when the next generation of political leadership comes, and all that we can do if we care about this kind of stuff is to do as much as we can of the spade work to leave them in a position where they can do something different and do something better. But they may have very different preoccupations. I mean, the fact that most people, young people, certainly those who voted were anti-Brexit, it doesn't mean that rejoining the EU, by the time they get to leadership positions in politics or civil society, in their 40s, their 50s, whatever, they may not sort of think, they may think, well, that's a dead kind of thing. It may be, for instance, that it's quite conceivable that they will sort of think, actually, issues of global governance are going to be more important than regional governance or something like that. So it's very, very difficult to predict. But we don't have to predict in order to hold ourselves to that task of trying to keep alive, as I say, at least a level of truthfulness and realism about the EU and also about what Brexit meant. Does that make sense? So I don't know if that's optimistic or pessimistic, but I mean it's meant to be not too kind of messianic, right? Because I don't think we, because certainly people of us who are pro-European, we've taken an enormous big hit, and some of that is our own fault, by the way, not in terms of marching for a referendum, not in terms of losing the referendum campaign, but all those decades in which pro-European people, particularly pro-European politicians, did not build a consensus within this country for that membership. And even very, I guess Tony Blair was the most pro-EU prime minister since Ted Heath, but you very rarely and would sort of say reasonably positive things, but all the time the discourse was firstly a transactional one, what can we get out of it, and secondly a kind of a sense of the EU as the other. It's a place where we go to make demands or to have fights or to have battles and all that kind of stuff. Now, you could say that Blair wanted us to join the Euro, and if we had, I don't think Brexit would ever have happened. And so you might call the villain of that piece Gordon Brown or something like that. But it's not just that. I mean, it's all these, it's all these people in the Tory party who, don't forget, most of the Tory MPs were against, before 2016, were against Brexit. But it was also quiet. It was also muted. So of course, when we got to the referendum campaign, how in 3 or 4 weeks could you undo all that? And that's before we even start talking about the media, right? So there we are. Enough.
Okay, thanks. That's good. Emma, are you in a position to be able to pose questions to from the audience? You've got, if you could.
Great. So thank you very much, Chris. We've had quite a lively chat function with quite a lot of questions. So it's 7:45, so we've got about half an hour until the end of the session. So I'll try and whiz through some. So first of all, Phil Archer says that he thoroughly enjoyed your book, Chris, and he asks, is there an equally well-informed Leavers book? His guess is no. Is that because A, no one has written it yet, or B, as he assumes, because the facts simply could not sustain such work?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that, however, because and in a sense it's kind of the debate's so polarized that we might not even recognize others as being well informed if we disagree with them. Look, I mean, I suppose one book which was pro-Brexit and which has been well reviewed and well received would be is it Robert Toombs' This Sovereign Island, Our Sovereign Island, something like that. So that would maybe be one example. I'm struggling to think of another off the top of my head.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to group a couple of questions together on a similar theme. So firstly, given the likelihood for UK standards and regulations to drift away from the EU acquis over time, is any process to join the EU likely, or the customs union or the single market, likely to become ever more time critical as each year passes?
Yeah.
And the corollary of that, given the importance of the EU market and the fact that EU standards have almost become global, is there any opportunity for the UK to actually diverge from the EU acquis?
So the first thing is that yes, in general terms, it potentially gets more and more difficult. And also, whereas pro-Europeans have been used to having the support of business, that begins to fade as regulation diverges, because of the fact that from a business point of view, you're then saying, okay, well, I've got to make the change again, and that's a new set of a new set of costs. But obviously, I mean, I understand obviously the tension between these two questions, because it might be saying, well, but look, if we can't diverge in practice, then we're not going to be diverging, and so what's the issue? But I mean, I suppose the point there is that it depends. It depends exactly what kind of divergence happens. I mean, or we're talking about. I mean, if we're talking, for instance, about regulatory standards around products, okay, so sort of technical standards, then you could say that the capacity to diverge isn't that great. But if you were to sort of say, as the kind of the Tory deregulators want, that what you're going to do is sort of deregulate around labour market standards, around welfare standards, those kinds of things, then potentially that gets so that's a different kind of deregulation, but still it means that you're more and more diverged, and you'd have to make more and more changes in order to kind of in order to go back in. And on the customs union side, I mean, I suppose it depends on not so much the extent of well, it is divergence of a sort, but it depends on the issue of, you know, how many of these new trade deals does the government sign? You know, even though people who know my stuff, and I expect many people here, will say, oh, but these trade deals are not really kind of worth having. But nonetheless, to the extent that they exist, it means that in order to rejoin, in order to join a customs union, we can't be a member of the customs union if we're not a member of the EU, but we could have a customs treaty with the EU. But then you would have to then rescind those trade agreements, and then you would also have to do the kind of the reverse process to what's happened with the rollovers of the trade agreements that the UK used to access via the EU. You would have to sort of roll them back again so that the UK, because those agreements are also changing all the time on the EU side, and so you'd have to reincorporate the UK into those. So clearly, in the same way as from the technical issue of Brexit proved much harder than people thought it would do, that the longer time goes on, the technical issue of rejoining also makes it also makes it more difficult. But it depends primarily on, you know, I mean, this speaks to the tension between those two issues. It does depend precisely on this issue of you know, we might go on for many years with very little divergence on some kind of key sorts of things. I mean, you know, there are various reasons for this, but you know, it's noticeable, and some might say surprising, you know, at the current moment, that they're not making use of the ability to get rid of VAT on fuel, you know, which was put forward, you know, as one of the freedoms that Brexit would kind of bestow. But clearly, you know, that isn't what it looks if that's going to happen. So that's a bit rambling, but anyway, yeah.
That's good. Thank you. I know it's obviously a really complex subject.
The devil's in the detail.
Yes, absolutely, as it always has been since the beginning. Thinking about Northern Ireland, again, a couple of questions on the theme. So firstly, is there any evidence that the Northern Ireland Protocol was actually signed with malice of forethought as a deal breaker from the beginning? And also, do you think the UK ever had an intention to operate the Irish border arrangements long term, with the border along the Irish Sea and all of these sort of complex systems that they're suggesting?
It's very difficult to know, and it may, you know, I mean, we can have all kinds of suspicions, but maybe, you know, it won't be perhaps clear until we get to the point where, you know, various kinds of government papers become, you know, released in 30 years time or whatever it is. I think there may well have been amongst some an element of kind of malice aforethought, but I suspect and fear in some ways that with Boris Johnson in particular, this modus operandi is, you know, not to worry about the consequences, and just do what you have to do to get, you know, to get through to the next day, or to get through to, you know, this particular kind of problem, and then maybe something will turn up. Yeah. Now, I'm not sure that is what one would call malice aforethought so much as just sort of an extraordinary kind of carelessness. But that's not to say that there won't have been people around him who had a clearer understanding of what this was going to mean, and they, I think, would, you know, if that is so, they would be, they could indeed be charged with having acted in, you know, acted in bad faith. And I'm not sure that, I mean, what it was going to mean in practice. I mean, at one level, this we know because the document was leaked. I mean, this was spelt out in some considerable detail by a cabinet office briefing at the time this agreement was made. But I think that, but even so, you know, words on a paper, again, it was a highly technical kind of thing, and words on paper are one thing, but whether politicians really understood the full panoply of what these these various checks were going to mean, I'm not sure. But I think that fundamentally, they, or more and more as time goes on, I think that it was, I think it feels as if it was entered into in bad faith, and they, at the very least, in the sense of that they thought, oh well, we can always renegotiate it later.
So leading on from that, do you think there's a possibility of Ireland reuniting once the real Brexit damage gets much worse?
The logic of the logic of the situation, in some ways, economically, is, you know, if you've got an economic border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and not between Northern Ireland and Ireland, then the economic logic pushes you towards reunification. Except for the fact that, don't forget that Northern Ireland is only in the single market for goods. It's not in the single market for services. And therefore we can expect a degree of divergence over time, economic divergence, between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So, for example, it's easier if you are building a building in Belfast. It's much easier to employ a London-based architect than it would be to employ a Dublin-based architect, right? So, so the fishes in that sense are going both directions. But of course, the other thing is that, you know, the whole question of Irish unification is in itself an immensely complex question, irrespective of kind of Brexit. So, although you would say Brexit feels as if it pushes in that direction, you know, I don't think you can say for sure this is going to happen. I would have thought Scottish independence, I mean, again, is, you know, you would certainly say is more likely to happen because given the Brexit has happened than would otherwise have been the case. So, yeah, that's it.
Great. So another question from Joe Wright. Brexit was promoted by and funded through self-interested wealthy individuals. How do we rebuild our politics to heal the rifts that have opened and to ensure that it cannot leverage their wealth to drive an agenda that is so detrimental to the majority?
Gosh, well, that's a big question, isn't it?
No pressure.
I mean, just as a side, kind of a side take to that is that I'm a little bit resistant to the analysis that is what kind of drove it, because I think it lets an awful lot of voters off the hook, and you know, we shouldn't kind of forget that you know, well, the people voted for Brexit for all kinds of reasons, and that they and that you know, they were not simply the kind of manipulated dupes of sort of powerful oligarchs, right? But, yeah. But having said that, I mean, you know, I mean, some of the things that Brexit has shown very, very starkly are the weaknesses and inadequacies of the British Constitution, the very sort of flawed and partial way in which devolution happened, and the lack of the lack of you know, the fact that it was possible not just for Brexit to be done without Scotland and Northern Ireland having voted for them, but also that it was possible for it to be done in a way that involved them in very little consultation about the way that it would happen. And so those kinds of things. It seems to me personally that the nature of the first past the post voting system has once again been sort of shown to, because of the way that, I mean, this isn't to do with Brexit, which obviously wasn't done under those rules, but particularly if we think about the sort of the 2019 election and the way in which it kept being possible to make these ridiculous kind of claims of, for example, oh well, so now in the 2017 referendum, to sort of say, oh well, 82% of the voters voted for hard Brexit, because at that point, if you think about the Tory manifestos and the Labour manifestos, you know, that they were, you know, neither of them were advocating soft Brexit or reversing Brexit, you know, which was manifestly nonsense, because there'd never been 82% support for Brexit, never mind about for hard Brexit. But this use of the first past the post system to amalgamate in all of the votes to have this to be taken to have that kind of meaning. So all of those kinds of things, and I think, sorry, this is also related to the constitutional sort of point, that it, and particularly the Johnson government, but I think that's inseparable from the Brexit process, has shown the fragility of the constitution in other ways. You know, for example, okay, we did just about get prorogation of Parliament overturned, but nonetheless, the very fact that it, you know, the very fact that it even happened, the way in which Brexit has been used to now to create a situation where so much of what the government does is not done through primary legislation, but is done through statutory instrument, and therefore avoiding parliamentary scrutiny. You know, and in some ways, you could say that Brexit brings this into focus in a different way as well, because one of the big claims of the Brexiters was you know, maybe their core claim of some of them was, look, you know, this is about democracy. This is about, you know, the decisions that affect you being things that you can vote, you know, that you can vote about and your elected representatives decide on. Whereas in fact, it's been the occasion for, I would say, I think many people would say, a quite extraordinary power grab by the executive and made democracy even more division in that way. So it's pointed up those kinds of issues, which perhaps also points towards their solutions. But I don't know. I mean, I don't see a huge appetite for at the moment. You know, there doesn't seem to be any process underway to look at constitutional reform. Anyway, things around that would be my answer. But I mean, it's too big a question for me.
Fair enough. So talking about the Brexit ultras, is this eternal shape-shifting stance, is it to perpetuate a level of chaos which enables their true goal of hiding corruption behind the spectre of the EU? It's quite a specific question. And linked to that, so Nigel Farage started it all, was very heavily involved in the beginning. Is he still a key player for the Brexit ultras?
Yeah. I didn't quite get the first question too. I'll answer the Farage thing and then I think Farage still is absolutely a key player, because and if for the same reason that he always has been, which is that as soon as he mobilizes, he takes votes off the Tory right, and he frightens them to the extent that they go to that direction to pull those voters back again, and that clearly is as true now as it has ever been. Because he doesn't have to win. All he has to do is to shave a few percentage points off. It was a very key moment in the 2019 election when he stood down. They were called the Brexit Party then, weren't they? When he stood down the Brexit Party candidates in all constituencies that were held by Tories, or at least so long as they had shown that they were anti, they were not pro Brexit, something like that. But and I mean that was, whereas if you remember, I mean prior to that he had been saying no, this deal is a complete sellout, the usual kind of thing, and we are going to. And we're going to oppose it. And then he said, "Oh well, I've changed my mind now because Boris Johnson has said that I can't remember what it was at the time that he supposedly said, but it was ridiculous. It wasn't anything new that hadn't been promised before. And then of course now here he is again, Farage, saying, "Oh well, of course Johnson has betrayed Brexit because of immigration." Blah, blah, blah. So I think Farage, or someone like him, continues to be. A significant player. And the first one was is the constant shape shifting of the Brexit ultras in order to
hide their own corruption.
I mean, of course, Brexiters. By Brexiters, by the way, I always mean, as opposed to leavers, I mean Brexiters. I mean, people who are kind of, in some way leading figures within it rather than just voting for it. They do come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and some people may find this a difficult thing to accept, but I think actually some of them at least are in a certain way idealists. I don't think they are necessarily seeking to what was the expression, hide their own corruption, or that they are necessarily more likely to be corrupt or more prone to be motivated by hiding corruption than other people who on the face of it, one might be more sort of sympathetic to. So I guess it depends, I feel as if I don't want to kind of overgeneralize about that, and I think you then have to say, well, who exactly are we talking about? But I'm not really willing to have that discussion in a taped, in a recorded conversation, because it's a potentially slanderous one.
Fair enough. Can the Tory party survive Boris Johnson and a failed Brexit, or is it doomed to split?
I don't know. I mean, firstly, and obviously, at some point, sooner or later, Johnson will go. And at times today, I've been wondering whether we're seeing that coming, kind of sooner rather than later. It's very difficult to see how that particular kind of coalition that Johnson put together is really a sort of sustainable one. Although, I mean, it's not that different in some ways to the coalition that Thatcher put together. And it has the same kind of contradictions of trying to marry together people who are kind of socially traditionalist nationalists with kind of free marketed globalists. And I mean, actually, that's in some ways the story, the big story of the vote for Brexit as well, as it brought together those two quite different kinds of sort of political ideologies. So my conclusion then from that is that if and when Johnson goes, it will be difficult for the Tory party to keep holding that consistency together. But nonetheless, the example of the 1980s might suggest that it's not a one-off, and so they might be able to. But of course, also key here is indeed the question we were talking about before about what happens to the union, because in a sense, if Scotland goes, if Northern Ireland goes, and Wales is a different and more complicated one perhaps, but but if we do effectively come down to a kind of an England rump, then that almost has a built-in Conservative majority into it, kind of regardless of who the party leader is and regardless of what their platform is. So, bit too early to tell on that, I think.
What do you think can realistically be achieved in it says 2025 review of the TCA? I think it's 2026, isn't it, that it's going to be reviewed? Or do we know? Is there a date?
I think it's 2025 actually. But it's a good question, isn't it? Because it's a question, because you're thinking, does it run from when it was agreed, or does it run from when it was yeah. Good question. Well, I'd have to go back and check that. I thought it was 25, but you could be right, it's 26. But also relevant to say that whenever it is, that a year, or even more than a year beforehand, you probably want to talk about preparations for that. Well, the answer to that is a relatively limited amount, in the sense that whatever it is on the trade side, it's always going to be a trade agreement and no more. In other words, it isn't something that can be flipped over into something like single market membership. But nonetheless, within the architecture that is there, you could add in probably, this would be one of the key kinds of things. You could add in a mobility agreement in terms of which wouldn't be the same as freedom of movement, but which would ease things for example, traveling musicians or performing artists who are traveling for business travel, other kinds of things. You could do more on mutual recognition of qualifications. You could certainly do more, and actually you don't need to amend this TCA to do this, to align on sanitary and phytosanitary standards. So there's quite a lot, I think, that you can do. But I think that as well as anything that might be done in terms of concrete institutional measures, it's also potentially could be a process where we do some confidence building with the EU. And again, it's difficult to see that happening under the present government, but an awful lot of what needs, the prerequisite of an awful lot of what needs to be done at a practical level is an improvement in the sort of the tone at a diplomatic level, and an improvement of that kind of relationship. So, so the process also offers potentially an occasion for that. But yeah, I mean, the questioner, whoever it is quite right to imply that, it's at the end of the day, you know, when we were always talking about all these different models of, you know, Norway, Canada, blah, 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 you know, and, you know, the UK opted for something like the Canada model, right? And in that sense, it's a free trade agreement. So I should also say, I was saying that's on the trade side. I think there's also potentially significantly more things that could be done on the security side. I mean, this hasn't been talked about nearly so much since the TCA was done, but it was quite a partial deal in terms of security cooperation, and primarily because of this, you know, this sovereignty red line about the role of the ECJ, because it's that which gets in the way of things around database sharing and so on, right? And similarly, you know, I noticed there was a question or a point someone made in the chat, which I got half an eye on, you know, about REACH and about chemicals. And again, you know, I mean, if this whole issue about effectively duplicating REACH, which nobody in the industry wants, is my understanding about it is that, again, the sticking point here, apart from issues of kind of just, if you want to say, you know, national chauvinism of, oh, we want our own, you know, we want our own system. It is, what is it? It is the issue of access to the relevant European databases with respect to REACH. And so again, you know, that I think is something that could be improved.
Right, I realise it's 10 past, so probably just another couple of short questions. First off, what is to become of UK citizens in the EU and EU citizens in the UK? Will there be any improvements in their situation in your point of view, do you think? And then I think final question would be, what would we as pro-European campaigners, what do you think is the most useful thing for us to be doing in this sort of period where it's probably not helpful to necessarily be very vocally campaigning to rejoin, but what is it that we could be doing which would be the most useful?
Okay. On the first one, I think, I mean, you know, and it's just a scandal that still hasn't happened. I mean, the biggest potential improvement that could happen with respect to EU citizens in the UK is to the provision of paper-based evidence of settled status. And, you know, I think it's, I mean, I find it utterly incomprehensible. I really do find it incomprehensible, because this isn't even a, you know, there's no issue of principle here at all. I mean, whether it's spitefulness or whether there's some technical issue that maybe I don't understand, but it just seems to me to be, because of all the people really affected by Brexit, I think what has happened to EU citizens despite the settled status scheme is a matter of national shame and scandal. So that seems to me to be the minimum, the paper issue. The situation for British nationals in EU countries, I think, is more difficult, and I wouldn't really want to comment on it, because as I understand it, you know, that is not a question about the EU or the UK and EU relationship, because it's a member state competence, and so it would be very different, you know, according to what country we were talking about. And I just simply don't have enough knowledge of any EU country to be able to say that. And then the other way, well, I mean, I think there's a number of things. I mean, you know, the first thing is to say, I don't, you know, the most important thing is not to go silent, and actually even on rejoining. I mean, although I, you know, despite what I'm slightly contradicting myself, but you know, one of the things which has happened, and again, it's in a different way, it's a shameful thing. And I wrote a post about this that I think was quite popular maybe a few months ago, is that it's almost as if half the country, or more than half the country, has kind of been cancelled. It's like, you know, oh well, you know, that's it, you're over, you're forgotten, you know, you don't matter anymore. And you know, even if you're the most enthusiastic Brexiter, if you're a genuine if you're genuine, I think, the idea was never to divide the country into two permanently separate camps in which one half was deemed to be, invisible and silent and all of those kinds of things. And I think it really matters to continue to make the voice heard, and to remind that Remain or erstwhile Remainers have votes as well, because the idea that all the time, and I suppose I'm thinking of the Labour Party in particular, that all the time that somehow, oh well, it's the only people who count are sort of pro-Brexit ex-Labour voters in red wall seats, and that these are the sort of the real working class and the true Labour heartlands and all that kind of thing. That's to me both wrong, but also actually foolish on the part of the Labour Party at a strategic level. So I think it's important to keep reminding, right? But another thing is, which is maybe sounds a bit kind of, I don't know, flaccid, but I think that, and I mentioned this sort of idea about kind of grassroots relationships with European Union, and I think it's really important that wherever we have opportunities through our personal or institutional contacts with people or institutions in the European Union, that we make use of them, because I think that inevitably, if you think about the way we think, anyone thinks about other countries, oh, well, the Italians have done this, or the Americans have done this, and we don't tend to be very interested in or involved or understand the internal dynamics of the politics of another country. And so seen from the EU, countries in the EU, it's like, oh, well, the British have done this, the British have done that. And I think the more that can be done to, I suppose what I want to say is kind of like humanize the face of Britain, to say, well, this is not something that all British people wanted. This is not something that all British people are happy with or are kind of giving up on. Then I think that kind of, again, it does this thing of at least keeping alive something that can be built on. And, to say something which is perhaps a little bit more concrete, I think of things like what used to be quite a flourishing movement for having twin towns, yeah. And if you think about the twin town movement, I mean, that's originally, if I'm not mistaken, kind of like developed after the Second World War as a way of kind of making relationships between countries which were in other respects estranged or had been, and so I don't know, things like that which it doesn't seem to have been that so much energy in recent years, and I think possibly partly because we were a member of the European Union. But those kinds of things, cultural links and so on and so forth. These are things which, at this point they all seem, fairly sort of, fairly puny and so on. But it could be that in 20 or 30 years' time, that people will turn around and they will say, well, one of the reasons we're able to rejoin, if that is what people want, one of the reasons we're able to do that is because when it was very unpopular and looked hopeless, a small number of people kept alive those links and those possibilities. So I think there's those kinds of things, but that's it.
Great, thank you, Chris. So I think we'll wrap up. I'll see if Ian has anything else to add at the end, and also I'll go to Joe Pye at the end to talk a little bit about the Grassroots for Europe Roundtable, which is one of the current sort of initiatives that are happening. So Ian, is there anything else that you wanted to say as we wrap up?
Nothing much really, just to say, yeah, that's great. Thanks for a very interesting talk. And thanks to all of those who've attended and all your questions and contributions. It's been fascinating. It's good to see and hear from the person who'd written all these blogs that I've been reading over the last few years. I still find it astonishing, kind of standing back and look over the last 5 years and looking how on earth is a very narrowly won referendum transformed into this very hard Brexit which is so unchallengeable, seems so unchallengeable politically. It just seems an extraordinary, manifestation of a highly dysfunctional political system, I would argue. But anyway, I won't say any more on that. I mean, I look forward to reading more of your insightful analysis. So it looks as if this is going to be a never-ending saga. I'm sure you're not going to write about it forever, but probably for quite
another book.
Oh, well, I was wondering whether there might be another book sometime.
Yeah. Brexit
Anyway.
2, the
never-ending story.
Never-ending story. Yeah, okay. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone. I'll thank you.
Brilliant.
Okay, if we can go over to
Ian. Yeah, and thank you so much, Chris. It's been really brilliant to hear from you. Very insightful. Obviously, we've shared links to your blog as well. Ian did a lovely review in West England Bylines of your book as well, which is you've got things. So thank you very much, Chris. It's been fantastic to hear from you. And
can I just say one final thing to people, which is that I am scrolling through the chat, and so although obviously couldn't deal with all those questions, just to say I will have actually read them all. So thank you.
Just before we wrap up, I'm going to hand over to Joe Pye from Grassroots for Europe, who's just going to talk very briefly about an initiative they have, the roundtables. So Joe, hopefully you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, it fits very nicely in with what Chris has just been saying at the end, to use all the contacts that we can to try and build consensus to make great changes. And I've just come off, we just finished about 7 o'clock, the roundtable 21. So we've been going since March 2020. In the background, we started off as pro-European networks of groups to try and build back some sort of relationship that had got completely devastated by the people's vote and the fallout from that. And very soon it became clear that without a change to our elections, our electoral system, and without changing the sort of democratic profile of our country, we were never ever going to get a chance to go back to even start thinking about our closer alignment. And as this government has brought about extra problems now with all the policing bills and all the bills that are bringing in to try and make us a police state, the roundtable now has got an enormous pro-European, pro-democracy, civil parties coming together to collaborate and to coordinate. Now you may be wondering, why don't you hear more about it? But very often we have to just stay very quiet in the background and make sure that we build the relationships for collaboration and cooperation without being public, because things can get in the way. But tonight we had Nathalie Loiseau, who is the co-chair of the EU-UK Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, as our main speaker. And to be able to talk direct to somebody who actually really does care about the UK going back into the EU, but also being very realistic about the complete mess up that and the nastiness that is coming from our own government. I don't want anybody out there to think, well, what the hell are we doing? Why aren't we making a better fist of this? We are making a good fist of it, and a lot of it is going on in the background. And of course, everything that Bath for Europe and the other groups are doing, brilliant. But do know that in the background there is a wonderfully growing consensus of really useful collaborative partners who want to change the way we act in this country, and that might give us a pretty good chance of achieving what everybody here wants us to achieve. So that's it.
Brilliant, thank you, Joe. Thanks for speaking about that. I've just shared the link to the Grassroots for Europe website as well. I assume if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll be able to join in to those roundtables? I know there's regular emails that come out from.
Yeah, I'm in charge of the website at the moment, and we, for the roundtable, and we've got quite a lot of work to do on it to sort of make it more user friendly. But just be aware that the cavalry's coming.
I always say, because I'm very active in the PR side of things, I work at Make Rates Matter, and a lot of people are talking about progressive alliances, and people must be talking about this, and just because you don't see it happening doesn't mean it's not happening.
We had Alex Cole with us.
Yeah, there are a lot
Cole
of
was at the round table this evening, and so let's just regird our loins, re-energize our batteries, and my goodness me, let's give it to them.
Yes. Well, we at Bath for Europe always want to sort of stick together, which is why we do these sort of talks and things, to try and keep everyone at least in contact, so that when needed, when we really need troops on the ground, then we are ready. So thank you, Joe, for your little message of hope at the end. And if you're interested, then yes, the Grassroots for Europe website is there in the chat. So I noticed we've gone a little bit over time. Hopefully I haven't disrupted your evening too much. I'd like to say another great big thank you to Chris Gray, a really fascinating talk. Obviously check out his blog for weekly updates on the never-ending story of Brexit. And as I said, our next event with Bath for Europe is on the first Sunday of every month. So that'll be the 6th of February, where we have an online Euro Cafe. So that's really just an informal chat about all things European. So keep an eye on our Facebook page and our website as well for details of that. And as we secure more speakers, of course, we will let you know who will be joining us next time. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we shall see you again very soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.